Well, welcome everybody to our Friday Forum session for this autumn 2023 series. We are absolutely delighted to welcome Gerard McBurney to our session today. So Gerard is a composer, writer, broadcaster with a specialist interest in Russian and Soviet music and culture. He studied English literature at Cambridge University before moving to Moscow for postgraduate work in composition and orchestration at the Tchaikovsky Conservatory. So returning to London for many years, he earned his living as a freelance broadcaster, as well as teaching at the Royal Academy of Music. And he has presented many documentary films on subjects including Rachmaninoff, Donizetti, Mark Anthony Turnage, and music by composers from the late Soviet period. He's also written and presented many radio programmes, the majority for BBC Radio 3, and he has also worked extensively as a composer of theatre music. And in the field of Russian music, he's particularly well known for his completions of lost and forgotten pieces by Shostakovich. So you're very, very welcome today, Gerard, and that introduction only touches the sides, really, of your very varied career. And I mean,
you missed out Chicago.
Yes. Well, maybe we can come to these missed parts of that introduction in our talk today. But I mean, our Friday Forum is very much focused on Peter Maxwell Davies. So let's start there, shall we? And I'd be really interested to know when you first met Max, what was the occasion, and what did you talk about?
Well, there wasn't much occasion for talk. It was 1968, May or June 1968. And I was in a Harry Potter boarding school. And when we weren't playing Quidditch, we were singing in the chapel choir, which is where I got most of my music education there. 3 or 4 services a week. So that was lots of fun. And I had friends who introduced me to Max's music. And then the choir master, a remarkable man called Christopher Cowan, whose wife ran something called the International Cello Center or something, which I think was in her front room, but it had a very grand title, Jane Cowan. And he made the annual choir outing, a trip to London, and you could choose which concerts you went to. And for whatever reason, we chose, it was either 68 or 69, I'm not sure. We chose to go to a concert, which was part of the Oxford Bach Festival. What was her name? Lena Lilandi or whatever it was. And half of the concert was Xenakis, and half of the concert was Max. And the Max half of the concert included the world premiere and possibly the only complete performance of Ecce Manus Tradentis, which I still think is one of Max's most extraordinary pieces. And I would love to hear it again. That's a very long time ago. I would love to hear it again before I die, as it were. I mean, 55 years or more since I heard it. So Max had the second half of the concert, I think I'm right in saying. The first half of the concert had that famous spherical cellist in, who used to do Xenakis's Nomos Alpha, was it called, that cello piece? I cannot remember what that cellist's name was, but he came on, and of course I'd never heard anything like that with all the twiddling with the knobs and everything. But Ecce Manus Tradentis made a huge impression on me. It was very, very strange. It was, I suppose, but I'm very bad on dates, I suppose it was the Piero Play, but I'm not sure. And it was Queen Elizabeth Hall, and there were the strangest set of soloists I've ever seen for a concert, because I think there are 3 or 4 vocal soloists as well as the choir. One of them was tremendously small and round. Another was tremendously tall and huge. it was all very, very strange. I'd never been to a concert with such peculiar people on stage. And I was there with my lifelong friend, school friend, and to this day close friend, Martin Pickard, the older brother of David Pickard, who's just resigned from the Proms. Martin and I were at school together from the age of 13. And we both wanted to go to this concert, and we both rushed backstage. And there we found the composer, who was very diminutive in those days and precise. He was wearing a tweed jacket, I remember, and he was scurrying along backstage. And so we rushed up to him as fans and said, that was fantastic. And he looked at us in a way that all of us who remember Max remember him looking, gimlet eyes, and said, oh, you enjoyed it, did you? Good. And that was the end of the conversation. And I started following his music. I never went to Dartington at that age, but I had school friends who went to Dartington. And every year they would come back with news of another piece of Max's. And indeed, I think I won a prize or something, school prize, history prize. And I went and spent the book token on a score of Revelation and Fall. And then finally, next time I saw him was during the first period of the first performance of Taverner. And a woman, a remarkable woman who knew him and knew so many composers. Sally will probably remember her. Her name was Marjorie Parr. She was an art gallery owner in the King's Road. And she was sort of like an adopted grandmother in my family. And she was encouraging my interest in music. So I used to go and see her in holidays. And she would ask very fiercely what I'd been listening to. And she knew about Max's music quite a lot, actually. And so she took me to what I imagine was the third performance of Taverner. And I saw Max there. Of course, he took his bow at the end. The work had an absolutely overwhelming effect on me. And I still, in my heart of hearts, like I know not a few admirers of Max and his music, I still regard Taverner as his greatest single work. I think, even though he himself in later years used to dismiss it as a student composition, very odd student composition, I have to say. I would say my experience that night in Covent Garden of that piece, and we were oddly sitting in the second row. She'd very kindly bought posh tickets. And the only other thing apart from the performance, which is emblazoned in my memory, was seeing Ted Downes pushing his glasses up his nose all the time, because as we remember, Ted couldn't see anything. And so how he did it, I don't know. And I remember Rania Ulfung vividly and his astounding performance of that piece. And yeah, I would say it was a life-changing experience. So I wrote him a fan letter afterwards, and he invited me to go and have lunch with him.
You've covered quite a lot of ground in those early years, but what was it about Max's music that really grabbed you early on? What were the main characteristics which attracted you to his music?
Oh, that's a very, very interesting question. It's very, very interesting, the more so when one thinks of the later journey he went on in his music. I think the first two things that struck me as a child about his music were his very, very powerful sense of the arcane in music, which, as I began to understand later, was, at least in his early years, it was to do with his very adventurous discoveries for himself of medieval music and so on. And I was very, very interested in medieval music. And actually, the very first letter I wrote to him touched on that, because I had become passionately interested in mostly French Romanesque architecture. And when I was 14 or 15, and I traveled in France and went to some very strange places to look at out of the way churches. And I was very interested in what would have been the music that would have taken place here, particularly because I was spending time near Cluny. And as you know, Cluny Abbey was malevolently destroyed on the orders of Napoleon. It's not, I believe, an episode that features in Mr. Scott's new film, but it's a pretty horrifying episode. And among the few things that survived from that masterpiece of an abbey are the sanctuary, two of the sanctuary capitals, which were behind the high altar somewhere in the Alps. I can't remember now where. And these two capitals, which are now preserved in the small museum in the middle of the little town of Cluny, have on their four sides the 8 musical modes, masterpieces of sculptures, but also the detail of those sculptures is very precisely connected to the different qualities of the modes as they were understood then, which is the early 12th century. And this actually has haunted me all my life. And that very first letter, I believe I gave my letters like everybody did to the British Library or whatever, but somewhere in there is my first letter to him, which was about the modes. And so it's that sense of the medieval, of the arcane, that I found absolutely fascinating, combined with a kind of dissonance, which, if you listen to it now, probably seems part and parcel of that long ago era, which quite a few of us are old enough to remember. I'm looking at my friends, where music was very, very different from what it is now. And there was something about that, I suppose, very loosely Euro-modernist chromaticism that I found fitted with the medieval side to his mind. And it was that, I think, that attracted me. Somehow he was making a link between a somewhat utopian modernist vision and something very, very ancient. I found that completely fascinating.
Thank you. Sally, have you got any reflections on the Taverner period? And
No, I'm transfixed by what Gerard's saying, and it makes so much sense. And by the way, why did Napoleon destroy? I mean, I know the Cluny Museum in Paris, but why did he destroy it?
To build a road.
Oh, right. Okay. How modern of him.
It was very modern. And what was even more modern of him was that when he went on one of his imperial progresses, he inquired as to why they had destroyed the city fathers went to try and invite him to take a diversion to go to Cluny. And he said he wouldn't go because they destroyed their beautiful church. But it was his order that made them destroy it. So that chimes quite a lot with a lot of the goons that we see today.
It certainly does, yes. I think the other thing I always think about Max, and I love this arcane, and it's the piercing quality that somehow those two forces produce. Somehow there's a piercing quality to that period of his writing, which is unique. I mean, just extraordinary, I think.
Well, I mean, it often happens with artists that you that certainly for me, maybe because I'm sentimental, I often remain very loyal to the doorways and the windows through which I first discovered that artist's work. And that's why I think my memory, I mean, I couldn't sing you a single note of Ecce Manus Trodentis, but it's still, the experience of hearing it still haunts me. for that. I mean, of course, afterwards, once I got to know him a bit, I realized that there was a whole other aspect to that music which I didn't understand, which was based on the discovery of Monteverdi that that Sandy Gurr's father had really brought about for that generation. And all those people were mad about the Vespers, of course, in particular, but not only. And all those Manchester kids were very touched by the encounter with Monteverdi. And I have to say, I mean, I love Monteverdi's music, but I don't really know it. And that's a side to Max's thought that that I've never really explored. What I heard was the presence of things like mensuration, all those Macho. I remember us talking about Macho very early on. Those and Dunstable, of course, he was absolutely fascinated by Dunstable, and I still carry a candle for that. I find Dunstable a very, very extraordinary and haunting figure. But yeah, I mean, I suppose that's it. And what you talk about piercing is very interesting, because I remember very early on, he was the first person who ever talked to me about harmonics, about the overtone series. And obviously I've been singing in medieval churches since I was quite little. So if you do that, harmonics surround you and you learn that that's what they're about. It took me years to realize that that's what Western orchestration was about. And I've still to find a book about, apart from Berlioz, I have yet to see a book on orchestration by one of the great teachers, which addresses the fact that orchestras, that the lifeblood of every single symphony orchestra in the world is through their engagement with the harmonic series. And that's what makes orchestral music orchestral. But which is odd, because I always felt with Max's orchestral music that there was something strange about his relationship to harmonics, except in one piece, a piece which is Welder's Bliss, which was the piece for me in which he addresses most profoundly the harmonic series. And I think it was very influenced also, oddly enough, given what a very abrasive piece that is. It was very heavily influenced by he did a lot of analysis of La Mer, and he certainly, I mean, I was about 18 or something, but I remember him showing me bits of La Mer and showing how the composer was using, I mean, they were quite famous bits, like those two dramatizations of the sort of embodiments, incarnations of the harmonic series that you get in the second movement of La Mer. I didn't know anything about anything like that. It was a complete revelation. My eyes were on stalks, ears were on stalks, I should say, probably. But and then I remember him also at that period. I was just discovering Haydn quartets for the first time, and I was fascinated by the G minor Opus 73, the Rider. It's 73, 70. I always get muddled. It doesn't matter. Anyway. The Rider quartet.
Yeah, that one.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. What a fantastic piece. And it's got this weird flow movement, which has a moment when it disappeared. And it's been a long time since I looked at it, and probably those among you who've played it recently looked at it. But there's an incredible moment in the slow movement when Haydn does one of those miraculous harmonic shifts, opening up C major, and the cello hits an open fifth at the bottom of the instrument, and it's is completely magical. It's also horrendous because there's no way that the other three players can tune to that open fifth. It's almost like base jumping or something. They're falling off the side of a mountain in Norway going, hell, how do I hold on? But I was utterly riveted by this moment. And I remember taking my score to Max's flat and saying, can I ask you about this? I don't understand how this is working. And we sat down and looked at the harmonics and how Haydn was actually using the harmonics in that moment. Absolutely fascinating. I do also remember being so excited that I was then foolish enough to tell Hans Keller about it, and Hans said, no, he has misunderstood everything about that moment. I, of course, was very awe-inspired that two much older men whom I admired had saw fit to differ so strongly. I didn't realize that they were both of them in the habit of disagreeing in that sort of manner, sort of quarrelsomeness. One story, I mean, because you pointed out that I'd had a lot in my life to do with Shostakovich. One thing that changed my life in that first lunch I had with him, apart from the fact he insisted on opening a bottle of Retsina, which is a substance I'd never absorbed before. It was a pasta, and he was busy making the pasta. And he asked me, I mean, I was a schoolboy. He asked me who the composers were that I most admired. And I think, I cannot even remember, but I think I said something really boring, like Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, Luciano Berio, and whoever, it doesn't matter. And he looked very pained as he was stirring his pasta sauce. So I said, so he then turned to me very fiercely and said, so who are the composers whose music you really, really dislike? And without hesitating, and with all the thoughtlessness of a 17 or 18-year-old, I said, oh, easy, Benjamin Britten and Dmitri Shostakovich, both of whom, of course, were alive and composing at that period. And there was an icy moment. And then Max looked to me and said, that means that those are the two composers whose work you should be studying with the greatest energy. And that I have to say was another life-changing experience for me. It had never occurred to my stupid brain that you study what you don't understand. You study what you don't like. You get on with human beings whom you don't warm to, because you, as the late Pierre Boulez used to say, the only thing that matters is curiosity. And as we all know, because all of us have taught all our lives, awakening curiosity in young people is not always an easy thing to do. That was I would say that moment in Max's kitchen was like a road to Damascus for me. I remember going home to my parents' house and thinking, nobody's ever said that before. This changes the way I see the world. So, whatever else one might talk about, I hold Max's gift as a teacher very precious in my life, and I know in the lives of hundreds and if not thousands of other people.
Thank you. You've mentioned Ecce Tridentis a few times now, and I know that Richard, you have done some work on this piece. Maybe this is the time you should come in. You're muted, Richard.
So I don't want to spend too long on it, but I do have some information that might jog your memory. Actually, the piece its original form was written for Warder, and it was in illo tempore, but he rewrote it with the beginning Eram quasi agnus, and then it became under the total title Ecce Manus Tridentis. And now the performance that you heard was presumably in the Queen Elizabeth Hall on the 19th of June, 1969. And the soloists that you mentioned were Patricia Hooper, soprano, Hazel Wood, contralto, Ian Thompson, tenor, and Michael Kinsman, bass. I have to thank Stuart Craggs for that.
Well, That's fantastic to know. Yes, that would have been right. It would have been. It was the day before my 15th birthday, I suppose. Yeah, I was 14. And yeah, and after, I mean, I remember him talking to the audience, Max talking to the audience before conducting it, and I didn't know anything. I had no background, but I remember him talking about the fact that he'd added, as it were, to paraphrase you very poorly, he'd added another bit to it to make a bigger piece than had been there before. And the other thing I remember about that concert is that he ended with the Purcell transcriptions, with the one with the silly joke about the 78 gramophone winding down and then winding up again. And that was, of course, my very first experience of his feeling for comedy, which was later, much later, to become important for me because, first of all, I didn't know music could be funny in that way, but also because at a certain point when I was a penniless young no-hoper in London, and indeed occasionally doing copying work for Sally, once or twice, as I remember, but it was a long time ago. My memory is rather boiled by now. But Max had sent me to Richard Bennett as a teacher because I said I really want to study more seriously, and he rang up Richard, and Richard and Max had a very uneasy friendship, but it was also quite a good friendship in a way. And I think it went right back to their youth and the fact they were both very fluent pianists. And they also had a surprisingly similar sense of humor on certain fronts. And that's perhaps a point to note that I studied with Richard for 3 years and with Susan Bradshaw, who became central to my life. And neither of those two people ever took a penny from me or wanted to be paid for the hours and hours and hours that they gave me. It's absolutely extraordinary. And that's what I found was the convention in London when we moved to London then. And I remember that Elizabeth Lutchins got very fierce about it because she was the only one who was charging money. But she was charging money because she didn't have anything else to live on, Lizzie. So it was understandable. But I remember her getting very cross about Max and Richard not charging for composition lessons. Anyway, he sent me off to Richard, and then I did various other things with my life, but I was living as a penniless freelancer, and Max gave me a couple of jobs, one of which was to sort out and rationalize the score of the suite from The Boyfriend. And if you look at the copied manuscript, I imagine it's in the British Library now, I'm sure it is. That's in my handwriting. And it took me ages. And he gave it to me, and then he got very, very cross with me because I took so long over it. But I was learning from every bar. The letters which I handed over to the British Library contained some very angry letters about how slow and dilatory I was on it. I remember him saying, "It's time you grew up and learned not to go to concerts, not to meet with friends, but just to get on with the job." We all have to learn lessons, and that was one of the ones I learned on that occasion. But working on The Boyfriend was absolutely fascinating because the manuscripts, which I had here in this house for years, but then handed over, the manuscripts to the original film score were all scored for different things because you can do that in the film studio. So there was one short passage which had 5 trombones in it or something like that, certainly 5 saxes. and it was absolutely impossible. It could never be played again, like most film scores. He made a suite from it, sort of by tearing pieces up and putting them together, which he did in the, I want to say, in the Queen Elizabeth Hall with an expanded Fires of London. And my old friend John Steer played the double bass in that, because I remember I ended up with John's part, which had a lot of comments written on it. And they basically, what happened, as I remember what happened for that concert, is they just sort of put it together using the full orchestral score and the full orchestral. Nobody wrote out a chamber orchestra score, which is what was required. So my job was to rationalize all of this. And I went right through it, and Max said, this movement goes here, this goes here. I want you to take that down to this. I want you to cut the piccolo there, just have a flute, you know, all of that kind of stuff. So it was a sort of somewhere between reorchestrating and copying. It was in a very uncertain territory, but I must say it was absolutely fantastic, because I learned more about orchestration from working on that, on The Boyfriend, than I did almost from anything else I ever did. So, Richard, you were going to
Gerard, in 1991, Max wrote your long letter, which you deposited in the, and Nick and I saw it quite early on when you deposited. I think I'm right in saying that you were the only person that Max really wanted to explore the deeper aspects of his music, because he wrote you that long 16-page letter, which is sometimes... Yeah. What do you think it was that that meant that he wanted to tell you more about his music? Because there must be something. He didn't do that for anybody else, as far as I know. Certainly not in written form.
Well, it's very, very flattering. And I remember being very, very flattered when I opened the letter. In fact, after my years in Chicago, the expression I would now use is, I said, holy cow, when I opened the envelope. This vast screed popped out. I can tell you the circumstances that gave rise to it. We're dealing here with a very difficult subject, which is the subject of critics and criticism. I think particularly looking at Michel and David. Well, Michel doesn't do so much criticism, but David had a life writing for newspapers at one point, and he and I had some very amusing, he got very, very funny with me, David, once talking about that. I always had a problem with critics. I always had a problem with criticism, with what criticism is, even though I went off to study English at Cambridge, and I was initiated into the arts, if that's the right word, the black arts of literary criticism. I found concert criticism particularly egregious and pointless. And of course, I've spent a lot of my life in the theatre, mostly working with my brother, and I have a similar problem with theatre critics, except that I understand the economic basis in the theatre, because you have, let's say, 100 performances of a show. So getting a good notice in a newspaper is a useful way of advertising your show. But in our country, where concerts are only done once, I've never really understood what the point of the critics was. Anyway, be that as it may, Max's hostility towards critics was greater than anything I was able to summon up in the pit of my stomach. And in my early conversations with him in the early 70s, I remember some ferocious conversations about critics and how evil they were and how they understood nothing and all the rest of it. Fueled, I have to say, on quite a lot of occasions by rather a lot of red wine. I do remember having lunch in Eccliffe Mill in Dorset, and Peter Hayworth turned up for lunch. And I had no idea who Peter was. And I've never read people very well. But I think Max kept me on quite a short leash to make sure that I didn't say something that would send Peter off the... And actually, I already was mad about the heritage of Furtwängler. And Peter, of course, was deeply informed on all of that, even though he didn't have an ounce of music in him, really. He was a sort of musicophile of the most dilettantish kind. And he most famous for not being able to read a score.
He couldn't read a score, Gerard.
No,
Peter. He couldn't read a score. I've been in Maida Vale with him, sitting with him, and he'd get lost time and again.
Yeah, no. He had no idea what a score was or what music was doing or anything. And he couldn't really hear, but he did love music washing over him, which is why he loved opera festivals and yards of the Ring of the Nibelung and that sort of thing. That was his real delight. He was a very charming person in his own way. Anyway, there was Max being ferocious about critics. So it was some birthday that came round. I can't remember. If you know what the date was of that letter, it was somewhere. Either there was a huge piece of Max being done, or there was a big festival, or he was about to have a birthday with a 0 on it, or whatever it was. At any rate, I used to write articles of one kind or another for Malcolm McDonald at Tempo. And Malcolm was always a good friend and very sportive. And somebody in Tempo, I went to Malcolm and said, I would like to write a big piece about Max because I feel the way people are writing about Max's music is not honest and it's not really about what his music is about. And it's time to hold his art up to the light in a different kind of a way. And I'd already done a sort of reappraisal, rather short reappraisal, for Richard Bennett, who had a big birthday and was completely ignored because by that stage, everybody sort of held their nose at his music. And I wrote a piece, I think, for Nick Kenyon at The Listener about Richard and why we should listen more closely to Richard's music, which I may or may not wish to do now, but nevertheless, I decided to write such a piece. And Richard was very touched. And so I went to Max and said, look, I think I can persuade Malcolm to publish a big piece about you that I would be privileged to write. But in order to do it, I'd love to do an interview with you that's not like an interview done by a journalist, but is, if you like, a deep dive into some of the things that I knew he cared about and that I knew I cared about. Unfortunately, some jobbing critic in Tempo wrote a piece around the same time, and of course you'd be able to find it. It would have been about 4, 5, 6 months or so before Max wrote me that long letter. And this person said words to the effect of Max's, if I remember, and it's a long time ago and I can't remember who wrote it, that Max's music has basically all died and the symptoms are a particular waste of space and there's nothing there at all, or words to that effect. Max absolutely hit the roof and refused to allow Malcolm to publish. He actually tried to get Judy Arnold to ring up. David Drew was still around in those days, and to say things like, I don't want my music ever again mentioned in the pages of Tempo. And you will all remember Malcolm as being a very sweet man and rather gentle figure, really. And I remember going to see Malcolm in his offices on Regent Street in Boosey's and saying, what the hell's going on? Max is suddenly exploding at me. He's exploded at Judy. And anyway, the answer to that, now is perhaps not the moment to go into every detail. It was not a very happy encounter between different people. But he said he refused to be interviewed by me and he refused to have anything more to do with it. And then he sent me a card, I think, saying, I'm sorry to make a strop, but I don't want to have anything more to do with Tempo after what they said about my music. I remember Judy Arnold saying to me, well, you wouldn't like it if you had things like that written about you, which was quite sweet, but sort of not the point, really. Anyway, he went silent, and then that letter arrived, which begins, as I remember, it begins with something along the lines of, I feel I owe you an explanation because we were planning to talk and then it became impossible, or words to that effect. And that was the proximate cause of that letter. That's where it came from. And it did indeed, it contained things that I still don't really understand, that letter. But it also contained that very important discussion of the effect of Koestler on him, which I do remember that when I was a schoolboy, we talked about Koestler because some of us are old enough to remember that in the 1960s and 70s, Darkness at Noon was a novel which was quite frequently given to teenagers because, a bit like Catcher in the Rye or whatever, it was the first introduction to the horrors of the 20th century. And so I only knew Darkness at Noon. I didn't know any other Koestler at all. But then I remember talking about Koestler when I visited Max in Dorset. And I have vague recollections of him talking about why he thought Koestler was an important thinker. But that all came bubbling up in that letter. It was all over that letter.
He actually talked about Foerster's syndrome in that letter.
Yeah.
As something that Koestler had said to him. Funny, you should talk about that, because my first proper article on Max was published in Tempo in 1996, because I didn't know there was a problem with Tempo.
Well, I think like most artists, there was something very childish there, and he forgot about things after a while. And after all, most people, especially artists who want to live their lives as public figures, and I think Max had that element very strongly. It's a post-war thing, at least in part. I think he's by no means the only British artist of that period who took that line. The idea of public address, the BBC, writing, speaking, teaching, artist teaching, all of that was incredibly important to him, and it was part and parcel of his upbringing, of the class background from which he came, which we talked about all the time. I mean, this is a completely subjective remark I'm about to say, but I think if I had to assess, if, as it were, in a gathering like this, somebody said, well, you knew Max all those years, what did you talk about? I would say more than any other subject, even more than music, we talked about social class. And I think the reason for that was I came from a world completely different from him. My father was an American academic, but sort of naturalized British by the time I knew him. I lived in a completely groves of academe world with tumble-down houses and huge libraries, and we had no television, we didn't have a radio, didn't have a record, where we had a wind-up gramophone. So we were living in this kind of odd, out-of-time world where every day, because Cambridge was Cambridge in those days, you would have Soviet academics and American academics and political figures would just come to the house because that's the way it was. It isn't like that anymore. And then, because my father had inherited money, he paid for me to go to an absurdly expensive Harry Potter school with medieval buildings and all the rest of it. And of course, I mean, I don't think it's anything particular. I don't think I'm very interesting or whatever. But Max was obsessed with different people's life chances. He was obsessed with where he came from, with his quite, which Sally remembers better than me, but his quite strange relationship with his adopted parents, with Hilda and Tom. And oddly enough, given that I came from a completely different world and spoke with this ridiculous accent, and I also couldn't, you look at that famous YouTube clip of Dudley Moore and Max talking in 1961, and they're already, both of those boys, talking in completely invented accents. Now, I suppose if somebody were to play me a recording of the way I talked 50 years ago, it wouldn't, like all of us, it wouldn't sound like the way I talk now, because language changes so fast, so speedily. But accent was a very big thing. Max talked a lot about accent, about the importance of accent and what an accent. I remember him talking about his friendship with Simon Holt and talking about how he loved the way Simon spoke, because he said in Simon's voice is layer after layer of the old north of England.
Yeah.
Which was quite surprising to Simon, because I don't think he imagined that was particularly how he sounded at all. But Max, as it were, I mean, Simon and I are approximately the same age, so we were one of a gaggle of young wannabe composers around him. This was a way that I found that Max held court, was to talk to these boys, and they always were boys in my experience, about why they are the way. He wanted to place each one of us. What were your parents like? What books did you have in the house? When did you start learning a foreign language? He talked a lot about the importance of learning Italian, learning German. I remember him talking, I don't speak German. I remember him talking a lot about, and I don't speak Italian either. I remember him talking a lot about reading Thomas Mann, and how he said that when he was young, he was so absorbed in Mann that he used to speak the sentences out loud and roll them around. And of course, Dr. Faustus is a very important model for Taverner, I would have said. I don't know the historical, the chronology there, but I always had the impression that either that Max had been very, very swept away by Dr. Faustus before he started on Taverner, or once he started cooking up Taverner in his head, he came across this great novel and it sort of resonated with what he was trying to do. Oddly, I had that same experience, similar experience much later when I went to Russia, and I got to know Alfred Schnittke. And Schnittke, who was a native German speaker, but he spoke a very odd German. He spoke the German of his grandmother, which was 18th century German on the Volga. These were people that, they were provincial Germans who'd been brought out by Catherine the Great. So their German was as far away from modern German as Quebecois is from Parisian French. But Alfred also talked about how growing up in the Soviet Union through his German relations, he'd managed to get hold of a copy of Dr. Faustus. And for him, as for Max, it was the sound of Mann's German that was utterly compelling. Of course, it was easier for Alfred because he spoke the language, but as he very quickly said, that wasn't the German we spoke at home. This was a new kind of German. I had to learn how to think in that kind of German. So I remember him talking about that. I remember him talking about, not very surprisingly, about Leopardi. And while I have no Italian, not much anyway, I find myself going back to Leopardi quite often. And I would say Leopardi is an interesting case for Max, because there is something in Leopardi's mindset, which is also quasi-medieval and mystical, and must have been something that caught Max's attention. So I remember him talking about class. I remember him talking about accent. I remember him talking about language, what the books were, what the music was you heard when you were young, and about opportunity. he talked powerfully about opportunity. He could also be, as certain people who consider themselves to be working class sometimes do, and it applies to people from other groups of society, he could be very hostile about what he called working class, which had a heavy neon lit inverted commas around it. I remember a very, very funny dinner party or no, New Year's party or something at his flat near King's Cross, and somebody had given him the Joe Orton diaries, which I think were edited by John Lahr, but I'm not absolutely sure, who then wrote Prick Up Your Ears. And it was either the diaries or it was Prick Up Your Ears, which had that very famous photograph of Orton looking cheeky with his hat on the back of his head, very flirtatious, very butch. And that comes from the period when Orton was working on the script for Yellow Submarine or whichever one of the Beatles films it was that Orton worked on before he was thrown off. But it's a very extraordinary photograph because Orton was a performer and he performs in this photograph. And I just remember helping Max wash up or something, and then leaving, and on the way out, seeing the book on the dining room table. And I said, that's a most extraordinary photograph, such an extraordinary face. And Max went very quiet and said, yeah, it's a very working class face. Look at those eyes, completely closed. Now, I came from a completely different kind of background. So I was just observing the way that he would talk about these things, sometimes in very surprising ways. That.
Did he ever speculate on because we're talking about origins? Did he ever speculate on where he came from? Because
exactly, because he was a self-made. I mean, Sandy always said he didn't understand how he knew German from such an early age. He was so fluent. Yeah. I mean,
well,
where did he come from?
Of course, I didn't know, and it was Judy who pointed out that he was adopted, and that was long after. Well, it was right. It was after Max had died. She told me this. I think. I'm pretty sure. I can't remember. Very recently. And of course, it was completely gobsmacking to me because I spent quite a lot of time with Tom and Hilda. And I was fascinated by their relationship with him, by the way he treated them, by the way he looked after them. I remember going to the first performance of the First Symphony, which I think was on a Saturday. It doesn't matter. It was something like that. Anyway, it might not have been that piece. It might have been another piece. But he invited me around for coffee on Sunday morning in the flat in King's Cross. And Tom and Hilda were there, and I arrived. And Max was actually out. He was doing an interview or something, I think. So I spent 2 hours with them, and all they wanted to talk to me about was what Max was like as a little boy, and how they had been given, but I didn't realize that it was literally that they'd adopted this child. They just talked about him as a gift, or she did, Hilda did, and about how it was so strange to have this child in this home who could do all these things that the other children couldn't do. And I remember ringing up there once and Hilda picking up the phone and going, Maxwell Davies residence. That tiny little flat. They used to love coming down and staying with him. And Tom made a big impression on me because of Max's unbelievable articulacy. Tom was the single most inarticulate man I think I've ever met in my life. He had a vocabulary of about 50 words, and one of them was the word, which is very hard to pronounce as he pronounced it, however. And he would drop it in like a sort of drawing pin whenever the silence grew too long between sentences. It was a nervous thing on his part. But I was staggered. Let's not beat about the bush. I was a posh boy from a background with money. They were so nice to me, those two. They were so kind and they were so proud of that man and what he'd done with his life. And they wanted to tell me. They wanted to tell me about the extraordinary things he'd done as a child, and they bloomed with pride. And I'm never going to write a book about Max. I can't. It's too difficult. But if I ever were to write about him, I would say that for me, when those two died, a light went out in his life. For all the difficulties that they all had with each other, that they had bust themselves, those two, in conditions of great deprivation during the war, to give this child a home. And I'm absolutely sure he carried that very close to his heart, very close. But I never had the discussion. As I say, it was long afterwards that I discovered from Judy, and Judy told me because she had been to get his passport had lapsed or something like this, and there was some question where she had to go and get his birth certificate. And it was at the time when he was rehearsing the Missa Parvola, I think, at the Westminster Cathedral. And she said she went and got his birth certificate and discovered the truth about his parents. And she told me that it had never occurred to her that they weren't his parents, not least because he started to look like Tom as he got older, which I suppose often happens to human beings. But she said that the story she told me was that she was walking back across Hyde Park and he was in a very strange mood. And she said to him, "I've got the birth certificate. You're adopted. You never told me that." And he was completely silent. And this was Judy's story then. She just said to me that she had said, "Would you like me to find out where you come from?" And his answer was, "Not interested." So that's the only story I have about that. I never had any kind of conversation. But maybe the fact that whether it was Simon Holt or me or Ian McQueen or his various other friends of our generation, he was always so fascinated about our parents and our backgrounds and all of that. Maybe that was connected in some way to the fact that he himself was a changeling child. He was a child of mystery. I don't know. I mean, we're talking about somebody we all loved very much and was also a very, very difficult man. So this is quite a personal thing to have up there. But he both hid things and didn't hide them in a way. I would almost go so far as to say that's also true of the music, that some of its most complex things are hiding in plain sight. And he was like that as a man.
Said, actually, I think in the letter they said to you, it's easy to say things behind a mask.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's apart from all the things he was interested in, like social class and background and where we come from and all of that stuff, there was and the North versus the South and so on. There was also that period. I mean, it's the period that is certainly 20 years older than Sally and David and Daniel and me. Not quite our parents' generation, because my parents, and so were Sally's, born a long time before that. But there's something about that post-war period that is like, the word you just used, Richard, about a mask is very, very important, and it's all over the art of that period, but it's also all over. If you think of what I still maintain is one of the greatest of works written about the fate of British art, whether it's composers or writers or whatever, and that's Cyril Connolly's Enemies of Promise, which is a sort of shriek of rage, essentially from the 1930s, because that's the experience he's talking about, the 20s and 30s. So I think it was written a bit later than that. It seems to me that the next generation, the Harry, Max, Richard, Thea, all these characters, the maybe enemies of promise itself is the wrong expression, but the demons they were fighting were a bit different from the pre-war demons that Cyril Connolly is talking about, even though there are links to do with very profound things in our society, which are giving us a lot of trouble even now as we 8 of us are talking to one another.
As you were just talking there, Gerard, the wonders of online databases. I've just had a quick look at the Tempo article that you were referring to before, and I think I found it. It's a record review, and there's a record review here I found in 1991 by somebody called Gerard McBurney, and you're talking there about the releases of the Martyrdom, St Magnus, Ave Maria Stella, and the Devils. But there is one from 1990, and it's discussing the Strathclyde concertos, numbers 1 and 2. And it opens like this. So you never know. I really had begun to feel that with the best will in the world, Maxwell Davies's recent compositional exploits were just not my cup of tea. To wish that a composer would stay in the same place when he finds himself moving on is not the same. Even so, the Third Symphony and their peers had me wondering what exactly had happened to the creator of the Second Taverna Fantasia, World's Bliss, and Hymn to St Magnus. Each to his own taste, but I find this renewed directness of substance and manner incomparably more convincing to the ear than the tail-wagging dog proliferation that dominates the first 3 symphonies, for instance. He goes on to really like the Strathclyde concertos, actually, but it's probably that record review, and the author, Malcolm Hayes.
Oh, we all know Malcolm Hayes.
So that's probably the...
Yes, I think
yeah. When I say we all know Malcolm Hayes, there's about 5 people who know Malcolm Hayes. He's sunk without trace, I should think.
Well, several of them are in this room at the moment, you and me, and I bet that David F. remembers Malcolm Hayes from some lugubrious gathering after a concert. Well, not that David ever hung around, but
lugubrious is the word.
Yeah. Anyway.
What you were saying about the difference between the 30s and the post-war generation, which is what Sandy, Max, and Harry were. It is different, isn't it? Because Europe was, I mean, for them, Europe was absolutely where it was at, and Sandy, for better or worse, through Walter and through his ineffable, opinionated self, but all of them were, in a sense, freed. I mean, Harry was the most mysterious and didn't really emerge till later, but they were kind of freed from that shriek, don't you think, of despair?
Yes, absolutely. I think there is a huge theme here about how, going back to Connolly, how do British artists escape from the provincialism of the British Isles? And the Connolly generation, after all, Connolly was, not to put too fine a point upon it, an old Etonian, and a lot of the writers that he was thinking of were, like him, children of enormous, if wholly dysfunctional privilege. The fascination with that post-war period, as many of us remember, is that not just those composers, but painters, writers, playwrights, filmmakers. I mean, Ken Loach, for goodness sake, everybody, the Scott brothers. I mean, all these people, even though I was making jokes about Napoleon, but all these people were emerging from a very different social matrix than the one before. But they had one thing in common, which is what Sally says, which I agree, which is that Europe represented a kind of break for freedom. And, you know, even for much earlier composers, it's not a surprise to me that Elgar remains so important in the English musical tradition. I say this in thinking of Sally's dad, of course, but because Elgar is without question, to me, the most European composer we've ever produced. It's yards and yards of, I mean, just masses of, very few of the post-Wagnerians, apart from Gustav Mahler, absorbed Wagner with the skill that Elgar did. And
also Brahms.
Brahms.
It was a kind of synthesis, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And so they're looking beyond, and that was, and even, you know, he's not to me a terribly interesting composer, but even a composer like Stanford, if you look at the later orchestral music, he's studying. First of all, he was a friend of Brahms, and I don't think that Brahms's influence on him was entirely benign. But if you take things like, you know, they don't sound like most people's cup of tea, but I'm interested in them, like the Irish Rhapsodies. They're basically a local boy's attempt to react to the Strauss tone poems, and not without panache. The third Rhapsody, or is it the fourth? I can never remember which one is which. It's got tremendous orchestral accomplishment. I mean, just terrific. And then you have, you know, all sorts of oddball approaches, like VW going off to Paris and having been studying in Germany before. And you have, you know, I remember in my Chicago years where I spent 10 years making this show, if that's the right word for it, Beyond the Score. I made 30 shows in 10 years. It was like airplanes coming in to land at Heathrow, nearly killed me. But every single one of those shows was about a different composer and a different piece. And I never chose the subjects of the pieces, because that's not what happens inside the symphony orchestra. That's not the hierarchy of artistic command. I would simply be summoned in by Martha Gilmer, and she would say, okay, next year I want you to make a show about this and a show about that and a show about the other. In other words, I was her, like the butler or the cook or whatever, which I loved. You know, she sent me off. And then one year she summoned me into her office and she said, one of the pieces I want you to do next year is the planets. And I nearly died because I couldn't bear that piece. But it's back to Max's remark in his flat, always study the composers whose music you don't like. That same year, I had to make a Beyond the Score about the Four Seasons of Vivaldi. Absolutely incredible to discover, even inside such a fluent and hasty composer as that, what the structures are that are going on inside that music, and how fascinating it is when you actually hear those structures going on. Planets is a whole other game of darts. And funnily enough, it was Ollie Nussen who, he asked me what I was working on, and I said, well, I was actually thinking of giving you a call because one of the shows I got to do is the planets, which I knew he knew very well. And Ollie gave me a kind of instant supervision on the planet, in which he pointed out all the bits that came from Schoenberg, all the bits that came from Stravinsky, all the bits that came from Debussy, Ravel, and so on and so forth. Absolutely fantastic, fascinating. He was a very, very good teacher, Ollie, as well, of a very different kind to Max. And I had absolutely, and then of course, discovering that right at the heart of the planet is this obsession that so many composers had at that period with Boris Godunov. And I had no idea of any of that. So in fact, it was a great exercise always to be given these pieces that I didn't know, not really. And actually, Max knew the planets very well because he had very fond memories of it from his childhood, probably being conducted by your dad, I would think. I don't know.
No, the Halle.
But,
the Halle.
Oh, yeah, it would have been, yeah. Who would have been? Oh, it's John Barbaroli. No,
Barbaroli.
Long before. Yeah. So, I can't remember what I was.
European threads,
Europe.
connections.
That's right. Absolutely, Europe. That Europe for them, and certainly for Max, Europe represented a continuity, a continuous culture where people spoke many languages, where people wrote music in different styles, where Max was one of the best read people I ever met. I mean, extraordinary. And his ability to quote. I remember I let my guard down and said I wasn't mad about Henry James. Ooh, I got a bollocking from him about how important James was and how I was lacking in curiosity that I hadn't properly read James and so on and so forth. I never understood where he found all the energy. I mean, I'm now older than he was, a lot older than he was when he said these things. Still haven't managed to find the energy to read all these things. But it's that kind of, and what Boulez called curiosity, that was at the heart of it. And I think that is something that the pre-war and post-war generation had in common, which was that their parents, whatever kind of background they came from, whether they came from a conventional middle class suburban background or an upper middle class background with money or a working class background in Manchester or wherever it was, there was a general lack of curiosity that so many people found in the world of their parents. And that lack of curiosity, I mean, that exists in lots of cultures, but it tends to bed itself down in our culture, as we've seen in the politics of the last 20 years, with shocking results. And I suppose for me, going back all the way to the beginning of our conversation, what spellbound me about Max was that I saw somebody who was a warrior in that battle, who was determined to stand up for the values of curiosity, for the values of intensity, for the values of having an international global culture, of knowing what was going on in this place and that place and the other place. And I mean, for me, he was like a kind of knight in armor, really. And that's why I found him, although Richard Bennett was very kind to me and taught me a lot, Richard was almost entirely lacking in that kind of curiosity, apart from popular films and the novels of Angela Brazel and the Great American Songbook, of which, of course, Richard had an encyclopedic knowledge of. But if you mentioned, I don't know, Schubert, you could watch the blood drain from Richard's face, as though he felt really. Richard always felt really, really threatened by the serious. It irritated him and exasperated him. Whereas for Max, seriousness was where you started. And for that, I will always be grateful.
Thank you. Gerard, you've been incredibly generous with your time. I'm just wondering if there are any thank you. Are there any final questions from Michelle or David or Dan?
Danichka.
I wish I had a question, but I never knew Max. And although I followed so much of the music. But it's absolutely wonderful hearing Gerard talking again after such a long time and talking about this in particular. There are so many points of contact with my own young years, and I've enjoyed every moment of it. It's really made me think back, remember a lot of things. So thank you.
Absolutely.
Well, I think there's a lot to be. I'm saying this partly as a late dad with two talented, curious, and energetic daughters of artistic bent in their early 20s, that there is something about the encounter with youth that lies somewhere in this discussion. Dan will remember that that, along with James Wood, I strayed into the orbit of the late great Nadia Boulanger in Paris, and that was another example of somebody who just adored to have youth around her. She wanted the life of young people. And one of the first people I met in Max's flat in Fitzroy Square, which was a long time ago, was Steve Preston, who died the other day, and who was, I think, one of the most difficult human beings I've ever known. A dear friend, but absolutely impossible. And for my 20th birthday, Steve and Max, or it was Steve who gave me this, but Steve and Max had a great youthful passion for Jung, somebody I have to say who has not been very important in my life. But Steve gave me a copy of the only book by Jung that I really, really love, which is Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. And at the front of my copy, which I still have, which Steve gave me in 1972 or something, simply says, turn to page 122. So I turned to page, whatever it is, it doesn't matter what it is, but let's say 122. And there were two lines either side of Jung's text. And in this text, Jung suddenly takes time out and he says, he's looking back to his own youth and looking back to his own also later infatuations with youth. And he says something to the effect of that between the ages of 18, let's say, and 23, the human being is in a place of ferment and formation, that the compartments of the soul have not yet congealed, and life seems to burst out of the human spirit, and the possibilities are absolutely immense. And Jung then said, it's quite easy to find this passage. It is somewhere 120 or something. He says something like, in those years, the true capacity and the idealism of the human spirit is revealed at its clearest. And I would say that if I pick somewhere actually in this room, but I don't know where, if I pick that book off the shelf and looked at that passage now, I would think, even though it was Steve who pointed it out to me, I would say that Max was one of the people I've known in my life who devoted the most energy to keeping that molten lava of the soul alive inside him, and to encouraging those around him to do the same. And I can't think of a greater gift to pass on to younger people than to show that it is possible. But of course, Max wasn't able to do it. No human being is able to do it all the time. And I confess I find areas of the later work incomprehensible because I don't hear that magma anymore. But that's also a matter of taste. You know, Ecce Manus Tradentis. I remember going to hear Ave Maris Stella in the Victoria and Albert Museum. Fantastic performance. Right at the beginning. He was wearing a huge beard. He looked like a sort of hobbit, Max. He came down from Orkney wearing the longest beard. I was just sprouting. It looked like something from a Harry Potter film. I remember him writing to me in the middle of writing the hymn to St. Magnus and talking, it must be there in the letters that I put in there, talking about the medieval, the Viking hymn and sort of whatever that kind of sort of organum in parallel thirds is called. And that's, I look back to, maybe because I myself was that age at that time. And Sally had this wonderful word she used earlier. She talked about, what did you say that?
Piercing.
Sharp, was it sharp?
Piercing.
Piercing. That's right. There is a piercingness about that music, which remains unbelievably important. I sometimes wish, I remember him talking, I know we all have to go, but I remember him talking fascinatingly about cycles of pieces and how, for example, the last three Schubert sonatas, which of course he played and loved playing, the last three Beethoven sonatas as a cycle, because however great the last three sonatas are, there on their own, they're even more great as a cycle. And he was very interested in this idea, at least he was when he was much younger and when I was around 20. He was very interested in this idea of works that talked to one another, spoke to one another. And he saw those early Orkney pieces, Ave Maris Stella. Hymn to St. Magnus was different because it was a kind of prelude. It was like Rheingold before the trilogy. But the trilogy was Ave Maris Stella, The Blind Fiddler, and Mirror of Whitening Light, which was meant to be the finale to this chamber symphonic cycle. So he told me once that his dream was that all three pieces would be performed one after another. I don't know if anybody's ever done that, but it would be a great evening in the concert hall, with the slow movement being the Blind Fiddler with all that beautiful pianissimo moaning for the soprano part. Incidentally, because I've never written this down, and this, I guess, if everybody's got to go, might be a good moment to end on, or not. I arrived in Orkney the day after Max finished the First Symphony. And Archie and Elizabeth Bevan picked me up at the ferry, fed me, and then put me on the ferry to go over to Hoy, on Stevie's ferry. And Max had finished. I was very shocked, actually, because Elizabeth, who's still around, by the way, very much so, Elizabeth said she'd been phoned that morning and she said, Max has finished a symphony. Well, I was, habituated to Max, like most composers, saying, why would anybody write a symphony now? It's a completely stupid thing to do. Anyway, there it was. He'd written what turned out to be the First Symphony. It wasn't called Symphony No. 1. It just had Symphony written across the top. Now, if you worked on the manuscripts, you might already know that. But when I arrived in the taxi from the ferry and we walked up the hill to Bunatoon together, and he made tea or something, and my job was to sit at his desk and read through the what is it they call it? It's what the French call a direction, a partie celle. The short score, mostly on 6 staves, but sometimes 8 staves. And I was under strict instructions to read, gazing out at the Rackwick Bay, to read the whole thing from beginning to end. So, of course, not really having any clue in my ear. How do you hold music like this in the head? I had no idea. But anyway, I solemnly thumbed my way through it. And when I came to the slow movement, which was the first movement that he wrote, which was originally meant to be a self-standing orchestral piece. Now, in his notes and in his interviews at the time, he said the first movement began as an orchestral piece, which was called Black Pentecost. But then the music sprouted and went, Black Pentecost being a phrase, of course, from one of George's poems. Maybe it was. All I can tell you is that I held that day, that sunny afternoon in Orkney, had the manuscript, the whole sodding thing in my hand, and across the top of the slow movement, but written, rubbed out furiously. He was a great rubber out because it was all written in pencil. And I could see there were letters there. And what the letters said was speculum luminis de albensis, which means mirror of whitening light. So as far as I'm concerned, the slow movement of the First Symphony was not Black Pentecost, it was Mirror of Whitening Light. And he then withdrew that title, and then of course he used the title elsewhere. But the chronology, you two would be better off working out than me. But I would say if you can look at that page and look carefully, you might need to take a magnifying glass, and you'll see that written up there. But I would never have misremembered that because it was in Latin, and I worked it out. That's my Latin was never very good, I have to say, but I worked it out that's what it was. And there's something curiously, how can I say, curiously symbolic, or what my Irish grandmother would have called uttering, about the fact that he deliberately confused a piece called Mirror of Whitening Light with Black Pentecost in his mind for whatever reason. But that's back to Richard's point about needing to speak through masks.
Really, really fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. I think there is one final question. Michelle and David have had their hand up very, very patiently. So,
oh my gosh!
Yeah,
oh, there's the hand.
The thing is, we're still in a state of déshabille, but Gerard, you somehow telepathized the question I was going to ask, which was precisely about the First Symphony and this sort of apparent change in his career. So there's no need to answer it because you already gave us a wonderful answer. And all I'd do is sort of say a very personal thanks for the best hour and a half and more I've had for a very, very long time. And Sally, if you're still around, could you just stay around for 30 seconds? I've got a question after we wrap up the session.
Of course.
Yeah. That's all from me.
Gerard, I'm this idea of Ave Maris, Stella, Blind Fiddler and Mirror is a fantastic idea, which I'm going to actually, I've got somewhere where I might suggest it. It's a brilliant
well, they're
idea.
all, of course, they're based on, I mean, I'm not really a magic squares kind of a person, but they're based on 3 magic squares, which then become the magic squares at the heart of the First Symphony. So the First Symphony, in a way, but this is a study for scholars. I got described as a musicologist the other day. I nearly had a heart attack.
Oh,
anybody
God.
less a musicologist than me would be hard to imagine. But chatterbox, yes, I can deal with chatterbox, but musicologist is a totally different thing. But there is something about the First Symphony to me which involves taking that chamber symphony, which is Ave Maris, Stella, Blind Fiddler and Mirror of Whitening Light, and then he somehow put them on top of each other to create that First Symphony. And I think there is a big study. There is a woman, I can't remember what her name is now, who was a student in those days, whom I knew, called Daphne Outwin. She was in touch with me a year or two back, so I know where she is. She's living in Scotland. And she wrote her doctoral dissertation on the relationship between those pieces and the First Symphony. And that she wrote a very long time ago, very, very long time ago. I don't know what happened to that dissertation, but it was an eye-opener to me because it confirmed a lot of what my ears had already told me. Anyway, so on we go.
Well, thank you so much, Gerard. An absolutely fascinating discussion. I'm so pleased that we asked you to speak for the...
well, I'm very touched. What a wonderful thing that all of us would sit around talking about. And I had a letter from Simon Holt yesterday saying, Simon just said, "I still miss him every day. I hope you do too." So that was nice.
A lovely
Very
way
good.
to end. Lovely way to end.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Gerard, bless you.
Well, bless you all for being so patient, and how lovely to
No,
see
you're
you.
fascinating.
Dan, how absolutely lovely to.
Yeah, it's
Lovely.
lovely to see you again. I hope we might do it in real life before.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay,
Thank you.
Love to the
And-
Principessas.
I will.